We often think of ghosts as echoes, faint reminders of the past, romanticised, distant, sometimes almost beautiful. They wander ruined castles, drift through candlelit hallways, or stand silently in the windows of long abandoned houses. We picture them framed by decay, lit by moonlight, wrapped in sorrow. They remind us of what was, of history, of longing, and of loss. In folklore, the ghost is often a symbol of something left undone, a grudge, a death unavenged, a love that didn't get to say goodbye. In literature, they're often tethered to a place, haunting not people but buildings, battlegrounds, or objects. These ghosts are rooted, residual, locked to a moment in time. But in the stories I've returned to most over the years, the most unsettling and the most moving apparitions don't appear in castles or graveyards. They come to ordinary people, in ordinary places, and often they only come once. They arrive quietly in the middle of the night, on a quiet road, in a dream so vivid you wake with your heart hammering, or in the moment you turn your head for no reason at all, only to feel that someone you loved, someone you lost, is standing right there with you. These aren't just stories, they're part of a pattern, recurring, cross-cultural, and surprisingly common. In fact, according to the Guinness Encyclopedia of Ghosts and Spirits, these type of experiences, what researchers call crisis apparitions, are the most frequently reported type of paranormal encounter worldwide. Not demons, not poltergeists, not haunted hotels or grey ladies drifting through tower ruins, but this, the sudden, unmistakable appearance of someone at the moment they die, or just before. And more often than not, the person seeing them has no idea that anything is wrong. They just know something happened. A voice, a feeling, a presence. Sometimes a phone rings and no one's there. Sometimes a name is whispered just once. Sometimes the person appears at the foot of the bed and says nothing at all. Then later the news arrives. A time of death is given, and the clock matches the moment of the encounter. Stories like these are rarely featured. There's no haunted house, no central figure to give the story weight, no black monk of 30 East Drive, no Mr. Boots haunting the Edinburgh vaults. They don't lend themselves to merchandise or tour stops. They're told quietly, often hesitantly, as if the speaker still isn't quite sure what to make of what they saw. Not because they think they imagined it, but because the experience is so unlike anything else it shouldn't happen. But it does. And it happens everywhere. Some researchers believe these apparitions are a kind of final connection, something like a psychic shockwave created by the death of someone close. Others interpret them as echoes of unfinished emotion, a sense of duty or a love that couldn't bear to leave without one last moment of presence. For those who experience them, it rarely feels like coincidence. There's a weight to it, a clarity, a message received, even if no words are spoken. Over the years, paranormal researchers have attempted to categorize and quantify these events. One of the most influential early studies came from the Society for Psychical Research in the late 19th century. Their Census of Hallucinations, published in 1886, involved collecting first-hand accounts of people who'd seen or heard someone close to them at the moment that person died, often without any prior knowledge of the death. The SPR was cautious in its conclusions, but even then, it found that these events occurred with a frequency that challenged coincidence. In more recent decades, interest has shifted slightly, from proving the phenomena to understanding its impact. Some psychologists suggest that crisis apparitions could be related to intense emotional bonds, an unconscious way of processing sudden loss, triggered even before the conscious mind is aware of what's happened. This is particularly evident in cases involving twins, where one reports a vivid sense of distress, or even a visual impression of the other at the precise moment of death, despite being miles apart. Such accounts suggest a connection that seems to defy distance, and they remain some of the most frequently cited examples of unexplained shared experience. Others argue for a cultural or ancestral dimension, that people in states of grief or high emotion are more likely to be attuned to subtle cues, even at great distances. One of the most compelling examples of this kind came from the early 20th century, and is often referenced in collections such as Phantasms of the Living by Gurney, Myers and Podmore. Two identical twin brothers, one serving in the Royal Navy, the other living in England, were separated by thousands of miles. On the night of October the 12th, the brother at home reportedly awoke in the early hours, deeply agitated. He claimed to have then seen his brother standing at the foot of his bed, soaked and silent, before vanishing. Disturbed by the experience, he recorded it in his journal. News arrived days later confirming that his twin had been lost at sea as a result of a sudden accident, and the timing matched almost exactly to the apparition. There had been no prior indication of illness or danger, and the brothers had not been in recent contact. The vision appeared before any official word of death, a common trait in crisis apparition accounts, and the surviving twin described an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though something vital had been passed between them in that moment. And then there's a more spiritual perspective, one that's harder to quantify but no less powerful. The idea that in moments of transition, birth, death, overwhelming emotion, something thins, a veil, a line, a barrier, and that some part of us, driven by love or duty or fear, can reach across to those that we leave behind. This is part of what makes crisis apparitions so striking. They don't behave like traditional hauntings. In many ghost stories, especially those tied to a specific location, the explanation often falls back on something called stone tape theory. The idea is that strong emotional events, trauma, fear, violence, can somehow imprint themselves on the environment, like a recording. Under the right conditions, that recording plays back. You see the same figure walk the same path, hear the same footsteps on the same stairs. These are hauntings of place, tied to architecture, geology, atmosphere. But crisis apparitions aren't like that. They're not bound to where something happened. They don't repeat endlessly. They're not glimpses of the past, looping like old film reels. They're current. They often happen once, to one person, at the precise moment something changes. Most often the moment someone dies. In physics, there's a term that describes an inexplicable link between two particles, no matter how far apart they are, where a change in one seems to instantaneously affect the other. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance. He wasn't trying to be poetic, just cautious. But the phrase has stuck, because it perfectly captures something that defies logic, while still feeling deeply intuitive. And perhaps on a human level, something similar happens here. When someone we love is suddenly torn from us, in war, in illness, in a tragedy we never saw coming, something reaches out. Not physically, not in a way we can measure, but unmistakably. Like a final pulse through the thread that bound you. A presence felt, a message received. Not always with words, sometimes just with knowing. We tend to think of death as a moment of separation, but these stories suggest that for some, in that final instant, there's a need to connect, to say goodbye, to let someone know. And when that connection happens, it doesn't need a haunted house or the echo of a battlefield. It just needs someone who loved and someone who listened. In this episode, I want to share some of these accounts, not the famous ones, but the kind that get passed along quietly over coffee, or with the caveat, I've never told anyone this before. Because sometimes the most powerful hauntings aren't tied to a place, they're tied to people, and to a moment that changed everything. There's a stillness to some corners of Edinburgh, those liminal spaces where the city's noise seems to fade and time holds its breath. Pilrig, tucked between Leith and the new town, is one of those places. Quiet streets now, but in the 19th century this was a boundary zone. Not quite city, not quite countryside. Pilrig House itself dated back to the 1600s, once the home of a notable Covenanting family, and later the area became a respectable suburb for ministers, doctors and teachers. The house is also believed to have its own accounts of hauntings, stories that may well find their way into the channel in the future. Pilrig Manse, where our first account takes place, stood apart from its neighbours, large, slightly withdrawn, and in the summer of 1883 empty, except for one woman. Her name was Mrs Elizabeth Duthie, and she'd worked as the housekeeper for the Reverend J.C. MacPhail for over 30 years. By all accounts, she was quiet, capable and deeply trustworthy. She'd never claimed to see ghosts, she wasn't the fanciful type. But one summer evening, something happened that she would never forget.
In August 1883, the family of the Reverend J.C. MacPhail had all gone to the country, leaving me alone in the house. An intimate friend of mine, a Miss Grant, who lived in Aberdeen, had been for some time seriously ill, and I was anxious about her, though I did not know that death was near. On Sunday night, the 26th of August, about 8 o'clock, I retired to my room, which is separated from the rest of the house, with a flight of stairs leading up to the door. I got into bed and was lying half asleep, with my face to the wall, when I felt that someone was bending over me, looking into my face.
Imagine it, lying in a quiet house, dusk settling outside, the creak of old wood and distance of footsteps long gone, and then the feeling that you're not alone. Not frightening, but certain, immediate.
I opened my eyes and looked up into the face of my friend Miss Grant. I started up in bed and, looking round, saw Miss Grant's figure leaving the room. I then got out of bed and, going to the door, looked down the stairs, but no one was to be seen. I went down the stairs into the kitchen, but no one was there, nor was there a trace of anyone.
The clock read just after 9 p.m. She returned to bed with a growing unease. No one else was in the house, she told no one, but something didn't feel right.
I felt very uncomfortable, and certain something had happened to my friend. All next day, Monday, I felt unhappy about it, and waited anxiously to hear of my friend. But, as there was no one else in the house, I did not mention my experience of the previous night to anyone. That night, I received information from Aberdeen that my friend had died at 9 o'clock on the previous night, at the very time I had seen her form in Edinburgh.
The death notice confirmed it. Helen Grant died here last night at 9 o'clock. Signed, William Grant, 22 Thistle Street, Aberdeen. Years later, the story still the same, no embellishment, no added drama, just quiet certainty. Mrs. Duthie had seen her friend. She was awake, her eyes were open, and the time matched exactly. Her employer, Reverend MacPhail, later wrote,
Mrs. Duthie has been with me for more than 30 years, and I know her to be one on whose statement the fullest reliance may be placed.
So, what did she see? Not a haunting in the traditional sense, not a place memory trapped in stone, not the kind of ghost that walks and repeats. This was something else, something living, reaching out. At the moment it became memory. One final glimpse, one last look. In the quieter stories of hauntings, there's often no scream, No cold draft, no slamming door. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than a knock. In 1883, a woman named Eleanor Woodham travelled to Edinburgh to visit her sister. She had left her home behind, along with the rhythms of her daily life, and most significantly, along with the woman who'd helped her keep it all together for more than 2 decades. Her name was Mrs Halahan. A charwoman by trade, she was in her 60s, widowed, and had worked in Mrs Woodham's household for over 20 years. Her late husband had served in the Coast Guard under Mr Woodham's command, and when he died, it was Eleanor who helped her find regular work. Work that allowed her to support 4 children, 2 of whom she had struggled with the law. Life hadn't been kind, but there was affection between the 2 women, a shared understanding, trust. Mrs Halahan had often told the family there was no one to her like the mistress. It was the month of October, and Mrs Halahan had expected to see Eleanor on the Wednesday, when she usually came to clean. But a change of plans meant her employer left for Edinburgh a day early. This unsettled her more than it should have. She remarked to Eleanor's daughters that she was surprised, hurt even, to have missed her. But she kept to her duties, and not long into Eleanor's absence, while working at the home of Eleanor's married daughter, she suddenly collapsed. A cab was called and she was taken to home, but she died the following morning. Her daughters kept the news from Eleanor for the time being, knowing how much it would upset her. But grief has its own way of travelling, and 10 days before Eleanor returned home, something happened.
I was sleeping in the room with my sister in Edinburgh when, in the dusk of the morning, I was awakened by a loud knock and saw the figure of a woman in a loose dress, standing at the side of the bed, looking towards me. I sat up and said emphatically, "Who are you and what do you want?" I repeated the question twice, which awoke my sister, who asked who I was speaking to. I replied, "To the woman standing there." Immediately the figure melted away like a shadow.
It was just after 6 a.m. Eleanor was so affected by what she'd seen that she returned to that room each evening for the rest of her visit, wondering if the figure may return. It never did. But she knew what she had seen. She described the woman's dress as familiar but indistinct, just a loose covering, not a cap, but a wrap or shawl. Enough to suggest, in hindsight, what she'd not seen in the moment, that it had been her, Mrs Halahan. Her sister confirmed the exchange.
"Don't you see that woman standing there?" Eleanor had asked, pointing directly to the side of the bed. I'd been awake for some time and distinctly saw her there.
When Eleanor finally returned home and learned the truth, that her servant had died while she was away, she didn't hesitate.
All at once the truth flashed across my mind and I exclaimed, "Why, I saw her myself!"
She told the story to her children. They believed her. Not because she was prone to superstition. She wasn't. Not because she'd seen ghosts before. She hadn't. But because her account was detailed, calm, and quietly insistent. And because they knew her. Mrs Halahan had died at exactly 6 a.m. The same hour Eleanor had woken with a knock. The same hour the figure had appeared. In telling the story years later, Eleanor said only this:
I feel sure that my dear servant, who was, I find, speechless for some hours before her death, had me on her mind.
This was no wandering spirit, no haunted room, no cursed land. This was a moment, a connection, a final visit from somebody who couldn't say goodbye. Pilrig in Edinburgh's new town may seem like some of the city's most settled neighbourhoods, their Georgian facades neat and quietly dignified. But in 1868, these streets were newer, prestigious addresses for judges, ministers and professionals, many of whom brought with them older traditions of belief, reserve, and the sense that not everything of the world had been left behind. The house at 9 Drummond Place had been built for comfort, not for drama. But one Good Friday night, a quiet visit from the past made its presence known. That spring, the Farquharson family was renting the townhouse while their home in Perthshire underwent repairs. It belonged to General Stewart, a strict and distant figure who had temporarily relocated to Torquay with his delicate daughter. The Stewarts had sealed off one of the upstairs rooms before leaving, tying a dressing room door with white tape and sealing it with black wax. The Farquharsons, unaware of any significance, simply avoided the small space and used the larger bedroom next to it. On Good Friday night, Miss Edith Farquharson, the sister Marianne, and their 6-year-old cousin Addie all shared that room. The child had a simple mattress placed beside the locked door. It was just before midnight when the silence was broken. Addie began to cry out in fear, waking Marianne first.
What is the matter, Addie?
Marianne asked.
Oh, Cousin Marianne, I am so frightened. A figure has been leaning over me, and whenever I put out my hands to push it off, it leant back on your bed.
Startled, Marianne shook her sister awake. Edith opened her eyes just in time to see the figure too.
She lifted her head from the pillow and looked up. When she saw a figure gliding across the foot of our bed, wrapped in a shawl with a hat and veil on.
The sisters jumped out of bed and ran to fetch their brother, Captain Farquharson. He was in the next room. And when they returned together, no one had entered or left the bedroom. Everything remained untouched. The sealed room hadn't been disturbed, but something had come from that direction. The next morning, as the household discussed what had happened, a man arrived at the door. Mr. Findlay, who had married into the Stewart family, had come to share news. Sadly, Miss Stewart had died during the night in Torquay. Her family wished to know when the house would be vacated, so they could bring her body back to Edinburgh. Only then did the Farquharsons realise that the room which the apparition had appeared had once belonged to Miss Stewart. And though the girls had never seen her before, the description of the figure, hat, veil and shawl, matched.
We did not know the Stewarts, so our imagination could not have assisted in any way to account for the curious apparition that was seen.
As for Marianne, she had not seen the figure herself, but she considered that perhaps a mercy.
My belief is that Providence prevented my seeing it, as I am of a very nervous temperament, and it might have had a very bad effect on me if I had.
What made the incident even more striking was the innocence of the young witness. Marianne wrote,
This child had been most carefully brought up by her mother and was not allowed to read even fairy tales for fear of having foolish ideas in her head.
The family told Addie the experience had simply been her elder cousin playing a prank, but the adults in the household knew better. Miss Stewart had died around midnight, almost exactly the same time the apparition had been seen. By the late 19th century, Edinburgh had its share of stories. Some tied to ancient ruins and some down dark closes, others to simple moments behind closed doors. This account belongs to the latter. It was evening. A woman sat alone in her home. No signs of distress, no flicker or warning. Just the quiet of the house and the steady rhythm of the city beyond her windows. Then something changed. She looked up and saw her brother, He was standing before her, still, watching. His face was calm, but his expression held a weight she couldn't explain. He didn't speak, he didn't move. There was something strange about the light around him, and it wasn't coming from the room. And then, just as suddenly, he was gone. She noted the time. Something in her told her to, and when word reached her shortly afterwards, it confirmed what she'd felt. Her brother had died in Glasgow, at the exact same time she'd seen him. No one else had been in the house, no letters had arrived, no news had broken. She had no reason to expect it, and yet she had seen him clearly. When they investigated, the Society for Psychical Research would later classify the case as a crisis apparition, the term they use for visions of the dying that appear to close friends or family. Skeptics called it coincidence, others suggested grief made the mind see what it feared. But in cases like this, grief hadn't come yet, the death was unknown. This wasn't a ghost story passed down over generations. It was a single moment, quiet, brief, certain. One person in one room saw something no one else did, and it stayed with her. The house stood quiet on the edge of Edinburgh, heavy with late summer rain. In one upstairs bedroom, a schoolboy named George Frederick Russell Colt stirred from sleep. The storm outside had hushed for a moment, replaced by a strange stillness. He opened his eyes to find the familiar shape of his room, and something else. Kneeling by the side of his bed was a figure, part shadow, part light, enveloped in a dim phosphorescent glow. At first Russell thought it was a trick of the moonlight, a pale towel on a chair catching the silvery cast of the storm. But there was no moon that night. The sky outside the window was black and unbroken, and the figure remained. It was his brother, Oliver. 19 years old, full of charm and conviction, Oliver had left months before to fight with the 7th Royal Fusiliers in the Crimea. Russell had missed him terribly. They had shared this room as boys. Whispers and laughter carried long after lights out. But now Oliver was here, silent and still, looking down at him with an expression Russell would never forget. Sad, imploring, loving. The light flickered and Russell's breath caught in his throat. There in the dim shimmer was something dreadful. A wound, raw and deep, which marked Oliver's right temple. Blood, dark and thick, seemed to pour from it. The image was so vivid, so physical, that Russell fled the room in terror. As he crossed the threshold, he turned back. Oliver was still there, as if rooted to the place, caught in a moment that didn't belong to the present. When he told his father, the reaction was dismissive. "Don't repeat such nonsense," came the retort. The imagination of a boy, perhaps, stirred by grief or guilt of the weight of the war. But Russell knew what he'd seen, and he would be proved right. 17 days later, word arrived. Lieutenant Oliver Colt had been killed during the storming of a redoubt near Sebastopol. A bullet had struck him, through the right temple. The confirmation was both devastating and surreal. But it didn't end there. In the weeks before his death, Oliver had written to his younger brother. Letters laced with fatigue and melancholy. He was unwell, tired, far from home. In reply, Russell had sent a message meant to lift his spirit, part sincere, part playful. "If anything should happen," he wrote, "you must come back and let me see you again, in the old room, where we had so often had a cosy chat at night." And so, Oliver did. Some ghost stories are built on violence or tragedy, places marked by fear where the dead won't settle. But as we've discovered, crisis apparitions are different. They rarely leave a trail of terror. There's no haunting, no clinging presence, just a brief moment, a message, a goodbye. And what that says, more than anything, is something deeply human. These accounts aren't about unfinished business or restless souls, they're about connection. People seen by loved ones at the exact moment of their death, across cities, across oceans, as if something in them refused to go without reaching out. Not to frighten, not to linger, but to be seen, to be known, one last time. We can't say for certain what these stories mean, but they speak to something powerful. That in moments of crisis, when the body is failing and the mind begins to fade, the bond between people doesn't just vanish. In fact, it may be at its strongest. As a parent, I've thought about this more than once. If, when my time comes, I'm not with my kids, if something happens suddenly, without warning, I can't imagine not trying. Not trying to reach out to let them know I was there, that they were loved, that I hadn't simply disappeared. And maybe that's what these stories are. Not ghosts, but final gestures. Small, impossible crossings made not through fear, but through love. Not all hauntings are dark. Some are tender. Some ask us not to be afraid, but to remember. And maybe, in their quiet way, they tell us something we need to hear. That death isn't always silence. That love, when it's strong enough, might find a way to speak. Just once more.